Next, we want to have Mellisa Travis, Dr. Mellisa Travis, speak. And you've heard Dan give her an intro, but just to mention briefly, I studied with her a little bit at Biola University many years ago now. She's continued on, 10 years. It's crazy, isn't it? I was really impressed. I remember, you'd have these discussion sessions and all that online. It was a distance learning program, but I always thought, wow, this lady really is insightful, knows a lot. And as she's continued to go on and get a PhD, obviously that's only increased. And she has her own book out. I've got a copy there I was going to hold up, but I was setting up chairs earlier. Science, I'll go ahead and hold it up there. This is a highly recommended book that really integrates a lot of philosophy, science, and history. So you might want to check that out. We don't have them for sale here, but you can find it online. So Mellisa, tell us about your chapter.
Thank you for all being here this evening on a weeknight in the summer. I'm honored that you would come out to help us celebrate the release of Story of the Cosmos. The title of my chapter is A Glorious Resonance, the Intelligibility of Nature and the Imago Dei. That's the geeky Latin phrase there for the image of God. So most of the time when someone hears me use this phrase cosmic resonance, the first thing they say is, I've never heard of that. What is it? And I say, well, of course you haven't heard of it because I made it up, which is true. So what I'm calling the mystery of cosmic resonance is this phenomenon that we find ourselves observing in the world of this remarkable harmony, or I'm using the word here, resonance. Musicians out there will know exactly what I mean when I use that word resonance, between mathematics, the material world, and human rationality. So mathematics, the material world, and human rationality. It turns out that this resonance between these very different domains is exactly what makes the scientific enterprise possible in the first place. And for years and years, I have found this to be one of the single most intriguing things about science as a discipline. Why is it that we can even do science? Why has the world worked out this way? And so this actually ended up being one of the key ideas in the dissertation that I just defended last spring. And I cheated for this book, because I did not write this chapter for this book. It's actually material that I cobbled together out of dissertation research. Because when you're in the midst of a dissertation, you really don't have times for other projects. But I love the idea of this book so much that I had to make a chapter happen. So you're getting a little bit of an introduction to what my chapter's about. But you're also probably going to get a little bit of extra material that I don't specifically cover in the chapter. I'd like for you to be curious enough to actually read it for yourself. One of my passions is intellectual history. I love the history of philosophy. I love the history of science. I love the history of theology, all of the things. And so I want to take us back to do just a few historical snapshots. A few historical snapshots that are directly relevant to this idea that I'm calling the cosmic resonance. So the guy that you see portrayed in this picture here, this is Pythagoras of Samos. You may have heard his name before in high school math class. You may have studied the Pythagorean theorem. Bonus points for anyone who can tell me the Pythagorean theorem. Hooray! So do any of you know about Summit Ministries and the summer conferences that they do there? So I spoke there in May, and when I asked for a show of hands of who knew the theorem, there was this wonderful geeky student off to my right who just yelled it out, and then there was this student off to my left who started making vomiting noises. It was great. It was great. The only time ever I've had someone mimic vomiting while I was speaking. Okay, so Pythagoras of Samos. So he is actually traditionally credited with coining the term philosophy, which means the love of wisdom. And the interesting thing about Pythagoras is that his oral teaching, he didn't leave behind any written teaching, but his oral teaching went on to inspire the formation of a school of philosophy that is known as the Pythagorean school. Now, one of the most well-known things about the Pythagorean school is that they believed that number is the essence of all things. So when we look at the material world around us, their idea was, well, because we're seeing orderliness in the cosmos, that has to mean that number is somehow fundamental to everything that we observe. So this went on to become a very influential idea in ancient Greek philosophy. So we can fast forward to this guy. More of you perhaps recognize the name Plato. Plato was heavily influenced by the Pythagorean school in the form it took during his time. And Plato liked this idea of number being somehow directly relevant to the material world, but he took this even further. Later in his career, Plato penned this dialogue called the Timaeus. And in the Timaeus, he brings us this, what he calls a likely story of the creation of the cosmos. And what he says in his story is that everything that we view in the universe is the product of the work of a divine craftsman. Okay, a divine craftsman who was able to put order and rationality into the world. Now, the interesting thing about this was Plato didn't believe that this divine craftsman actually made the material stuff of the world. He thought that the material stuff was just co-eternal with the divine craftsman. But there came a time when the craftsman decided to order everything in a rational way by looking at an abstract plan. Okay? So this idea that we have this mathematically ordered and harmonious universe is due to the craftsman having at his disposal this abstract plan called the realm of forms. So this is where these perfect ideas of rational figures existed, again, in the abstract, not tangibly, that the craftsman was able to use as a pattern to order the cosmos. He went beyond this idea of basically the Pythagorean concept of number underlying the material world to say, in addition to this, there's something about the human soul that is able to resonate with what we observe. There's something about the human soul that is able to reflect this rationality that pervades all things. And because we have this correspondence between human rationality and the orderly material world, we're able to study it, and our minds are raised beyond the material to contemplate the idea of there being a higher intelligence that transcends all of these things that we observe. Fast forward again, and we come to this gentleman, Philo of Alexandria. What's significant about Philo of Alexandria is that he was a Jewish monotheist. He was a Jewish monotheist who was very well educated in the Pythagorean Platonic tradition. He was very, very well read in that philosophy and liked it a lot. But he wanted to reconcile ancient Greek philosophy, particularly that tradition, with his Jewish theology. So what Philo said was, of course there was a rational plan for creation, but this plan pre-existed in the mind of God. So you see the dramatic philosophical shift there. We went from Plato, who said, no, there's this plan that coexisted with the craftsman that exists out in the abstract, and he didn't create that plan. He was bound by that plan in order to be able to produce a rational universe. But Philo strongly disagreed because of his Jewish monotheism. He said, no, of course there was a rational plan, but this rational plan has existed from eternity in the mind of God. And then he went beyond this, just like Plato did, and he said the divine reason, the rationality of God, is made manifest in the tangible creation, but also in the mind of man. So when he said this, he tied it to the Hebrew doctrine of man being made in the image of God. So before we get to Galileo, let me back up one more time. So what happened after this was the philosophy of Philo was adopted by some of the early Christian church fathers, early Christian theologians. Surprisingly, Philo didn't end up being much of an influence at all on subsequent Jewish philosophy, which is very surprising, but an enormous influence on Christian philosophy of religion, Christian natural theology. So if you want to read a little bit more about that, I mentioned in the chapter that St. Augustine of Hippo is a good one to read, who adopted the exact same idea that Philo had about the plan for creation pre-existing in the mind of God. And he explains why stopping with just a rational plan the way Plato did, a plan that coexisted outside of God, that God had nothing to do with, actually ends up in heresy. So very interesting point to read about. Fast forward again, and we come to the scientific revolution, and you're all familiar with Galileo Galilei. Besides his big famous dust-up with the Roman Catholic Church, you may remember that he was famous for developing telescopes, not the original inventor, but he was able to develop telescopes that were able to assist him in stellar observations, and he ended up making some observations that went to support the theory of heliocentrism, or the idea that the sun is at the center rather than the planet Earth being at the center and everything revolving around planet Earth. So he made some observations that went on to support that theory. But the remarkable thing about Galileo's thought was that he would often wax a little philosophical about his work, about the orderliness of the cosmos, the grandeur of the cosmos. And one of the things he said was, this all-encompassing book that is constantly open before our eyes, that is the universe, is written in mathematical language. He said it's written in mathematical language. So I want you to stop and notice the continuity of the intellectual history that I've told you so far, going all the way back to Pythagoras. This idea of mathematics, of number, being somehow fundamental to our material reality. Now, a contemporary of Galileo was our Wayne, our beloved Johannes Kepler. My cat's name is Kepler. I should have brought you a picture because he has really long white hair around his neck, and it's really uncanny, I'm telling you. So Johannes Kepler, one of my intellectual heroes, he was actually the centerpiece figure of my dissertation work. I just can't even tell you how much of a hero he is to me. But Kepler, like Galileo and like many of the great thinkers before him, was amazed by the rationality of the cosmos and the fact that we are able to do science. And he said, to God, there are in the whole material world material laws, figures, and relations of most special excellency and of the most appropriate order. So he's talking about the laws of science. And these figures and relations, he's talking about the mathematics of these laws. He says these laws are within the grasp of the human mind. God wanted us to recognize them by creating us after his own image so that we could share in his own thoughts. So this is the bottom part of this quote is the one that you may have heard paraphrased before. It's often paraphrased as when we do science, we're thinking God's thoughts after him. But this is actually the exact wording of what it was that Johannes Kepler said. Okay, so here we are at the scientific revolution, and we're looking at this really remarkable situation that we find ourselves in with the laws of nature being written in mathematics and the world being orderly in such a way that mathematics can tap into the material secrets of the universe. And then we have these minds that can pull it all together and make scientific discovery. So all of these philosophers and great men of science, they were recognizing how absolutely remarkable this is. Now, if we take Kepler's ideas, not just from these quotes, but from his broader writings, we can actually create an interesting little schematic. And I call this the Keplerian three-part harmony. Remember, we're talking about the cosmic resonance of mathematics, the material stuff of the world, and human rationality. This is how Kepler explained the situation. He said what it really boils down to is that there was a mathematical archetype, a mathematical plan that pre-existed the universe. And I have it at the top of the triangle because Kepler insisted it existed in the mind of God. This archetype was made manifest in the material world as the copy of the archetype. But not only that, man was created in the image of God, and because we are created in God's image, there is an analogy between the divine rationality and the rationality of human beings. So we have man created in the image of God, observing the copy and discerning that there must have been an archetype, and that archetype had to have existed eternally in the mind of the Creator. So this is a very Christian idea, okay? Johannes Kepler, devout Christian. And this was his explanation for what I'm calling the grand cosmic resonance. Now we're going to skip forward again. I want to skip forward to what I think in my head of as the early 20th century physics revolution. I don't think anyone really calls it that. That's just how I think of it because of the dramatic strides that were being made in physics during the first part of the 20th century. Max Planck, very, very interesting figure who was deeply fascinated with questions about science and religion, actually. So Nobel Prize winner, 1918 Nobel Prize winner, also considered the father of quantum theory. For those of you that don't know what quantum theory is, it's the field of science that deals with how matter and energy behave at the atomic and subatomic levels. But in a book entitled Scientific Autobiography, and look it up, it's free to read online, and it's very readable. It's a wonderful essay that he's written. He said, I'm going to give you this very long quote, okay? And after I give you the very long quote, I'm going to explain exactly what he's saying in the quote. It's just, as an instructor, I always like my students to hear people in their own words. So if you'll bear with me through his quote. He said, my original decision to devote myself to science was a direct result of the discovery which has never ceased to fill me with enthusiasm since my early youth, the comprehension of the far from obvious fact that the laws of human reasoning coincide with the laws governing the sequences of the impressions we receive from the world about us, that therefore pure reasoning can enable man to gain an insight into the mechanism of the latter. Okay, huge mouthful there. Basically what he's saying is his decision to devote his life to the scientific enterprise was the result of this remarkable situation of cosmic resonance, that we can formulate these mathematical laws and they coincide with human reasoning. Albert Einstein, he was a colleague of Planck, and Albert Einstein said in several different places, if you've ever read any of Einstein's essays, in several different places he uses the word miracle. He says it is a miracle that the cosmos is even comprehensible. Now, he wasn't a theist in any traditional sense of the term. He didn't believe in a personal God. But his entire life, he was just flabbergasted that we find ourselves in this situation. How am I doing on time, Alan?
You're fine. You've got another 5-8 minutes.
Okay, good. Okay, good. I'll try to go fast and not talk about my cat. Okay, Fast forward again. Okay, fast forward again, modern day. Some of you may have heard of Dr. Roger Penrose. Probably most well known in the general public for the work that he did with the late Dr. Stephen Hawking. In his book, The Road to Reality, he makes what I think is a rather stunning admission. He says, there is an extraordinary concurrence between the workings of the natural world at its most fundamental levels and sophisticated mathematical theory. It makes no sense to me that this concurrence is merely the result of our trying to fit the observational facts into some organizational scheme that we can comprehend. The extraordinary concurrence between nature and sophisticated, beautiful mathematics is something that is just out there. And in his book, he offers this really cool diagram. And he calls this the three worlds, three mysteries problem. So at the top, we have the world of mathematics, this abstract realm where we have all these mathematical truths that seem to be eternal and objective, right? Then in the bottom right-hand circle, we have the physical world. And he's saying mathematics, to an uncanny extent, is mapping onto the physical world. And then the third world is the mental world, or the world of human consciousness. Now, the three mysteries that are involved with these three worlds are what I've already mentioned, the fact that mathematics maps so well onto the physical world. But then because Dr. Penrose is a materialist, he says, but this physical world has somehow given rise to human consciousness and human rationality. So he would say that there's no such thing as an immaterial mind. We just have material brains, but somehow these brains have woken up and become conscious and have all the cognitive equipment to do the advanced mathematics involved in fields such as theoretical physics. And then the final mystery is the fact that with our conscious rationality, we have somehow been able to tap into that immaterial world of mathematics. And at the end of the day, he says there is no rational explanation for this. And the reason why is because it's not a scientific question. It's a philosophical question. Someone who shares this sense of mystery about this is atheist philosopher at NYU, Dr. Thomas Nagel. And in this absolutely fantastic book, Mind and Cosmos, he says this: the intelligibility of the world is no accident. Mind, in this view, is doubly related to the natural order. Nature is such as to give rise to conscious beings with minds, and it is such as to be comprehensible to such beings. There are things that science as presently conceived does not help us to understand, and which we can see from the internal features of physical science it is not going to explain. So I want to be careful to point out, he's not saying science hasn't already figured this out, and one day, perhaps it will. That's not at all what he's saying, and if you read the book, you'll get his broader argument. But what he's saying in this quote is science would have to undergo some dramatic philosophical shift of some sort, and he doesn't know what that could possibly be in order to be able to tackle a question of this type, because empirical sciences will never, ever get us there. That's why he says it is not going to explain this if it's science as presently conceived. Okay? So the problem is it's not, as I said, a scientific question. It's a metaphysical question. Why do we find ourselves in a world with such a wonderful resonance between mathematics, the material world, and human rationality? Well, I'll let you read my chapter to get more of the details, but I will go ahead and spoil the ending for you, and that is I believe that Kepler was exactly right. that it is because the material world is modeled after a super rational archetype, and that when we observe the material world, we get the sense of the amazing rationality that is behind all that we are observing. One of my modern heroes, Dr. John Lennox, says something that I think is astoundingly Keplerian, but in the context, he doesn't mention Kepler, and if I ever get to meet him in person, I'm going to ask him why. But in his book, God's Undertaker Has Science Buried God, he says, it's not surprising when the mathematical theories spun by human minds, created in the image of God's mind, find ready application in a universe whose architect was that same creative mind. So the Keplerian three-part harmony. So here is my bottom line. The remarkable resonance, the cosmic resonance between nature, mathematics, and the human mind that makes the natural sciences possible has powerful positive implications for the existence of a mind in whose image we are made.
Thanks, Mellisa. Great presentation. Very thought-provoking.